Hey guys, welcome back to the Moxon Vise build here on SimpleCove.com. In this video, we're going to be covering the benchtop accessory for the Moxon Vise. If you didn't catch the part 1 of the series, go back and check it out. This is where we actually cover building the Moxon Vise itself. In this video, we're going to be building an accessory for the back of it that's going to be a benchtop. To begin, we'll talk about the benchtop itself. I got a 12-inch wide, 24-inch long board, and it's a little over 1.5 inches thick, just so I can let it set for a couple of days to move, and then I'll end up milling it, flattening it, taking it down to its final 1.5 inches in thickness. The way it sets is it's 12 inches wide, and it's over 24 inches long, but it's 12 inches wide exactly the way it sets, and I still haven't cleaned up the edges of the board, so I'm probably not going to be able to get the full 12 inches in width, but that's okay. It's just going to be a bench top. If it's a little bit smaller, that's not a problem. The lumber that I use for this is, again, the same 40-year-old cherry that I use on the Moxon Vise itself. I had just enough to make a bench top so I can keep it the same species. Now, the lumber that I had to choose from wasn't great. I had to work around some knots and some cracks. So this lumber has some flaws in it, but it's not that big of a deal. I have a knot with a crack in it and a couple of wormholes that I'm not even going to fill because they're not that bad. As long as this tabletop or bench top is true, flat, and sturdy, these little blemishes like that are not a big deal, because we're going to more than likely be chiseling on this and hammering and sawing on this, so it's not that big of a deal. It's just a bench top. So to talk briefly about the size of the legs, I have the 12 inches in length, but the width is actually 5 3/4, and that's just so that when we get the top milled and the joinery cut in here, if we happen to make it a little bit thinner than 1.5 inches, or we make the joinery a little too deep, it's not going to be an issue because we'll have the extra length that we could then come and cut off of the legs. Because the goal of this bench top is to be flush with the rear of this vise. So if we make it too thin or make the joinery too deep and our legs are exactly 5 1/2, there's a good chance that it's going to set below the top or the edge of this rear vise piece. So we want it to be flush or above, because we can always come back and take some off of these legs to make it exact. It's easier for me to reference this in my crosscut sled and keep nibbling away and taking some off of this until it's exactly flush with the rear vise or the rear piece of the vise. So if you have enough lumber, try to make yours just a little bit wider, because you can always take some of that off. So what I've done is I have 2 boards edge glued to get me the 12 inches in length and the 5 3/4 in width. That's just going to give me a little bit of extra room. I've got everything milled up, and now I need to take the legs down to their final length. I was able to get 11 3/4 out of the bench top, and I was able to get the 24 just fine. So the legs that I have are a little oversized. They're a little bit thicker than 1.5 inches, but that's okay. I think they're 1 5/8 inches. And the length is 12 1/2, so I need to take them down to the size they need to be. So to do that, I'm actually going to reference the bench top itself. Make sure it's square to the bench top and make it flush over here on one edge, because I know that both of the edges on this bench top are parallel, and I'm just going to take a pencil and mark a line, and that's where I need to cut to remove. And if it's still a little bit longer than the edges of the bench top, I'll just use my hand plane to take it down. And so now I've got all of them marked. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to put these boards side by side, and I'm going to check and see. And my lines actually line up in the same exact spot across these 3, so all I got to do is put a stop block in my crosscut sled and repeat these cuts 3 times, because I know that it's going to be the same exact length. And to make sure that I have my stop block in the right place, I'm going to go ahead and extend this line up to the face of the board. And then when I line it up, that mark should line up with the kerf of my blade. And it is, so I'm going to go ahead and batch these out. So we're ready to go ahead and cut the notches out in the bench top for the legs. So what I'm going to do first is line up the leg flush with the edge, or the end and the edges. And then again, use a couple of combination squares to make sure that it is square to the edge and flush. So it's good there. And then I'm just going to zero this out and make sure that we're good. And we're flush. So I just got a 0.5 millimeter pencil, and I'm going to go ahead and scribe a line on the bench top where this is going to be cut out. So here's the line that I drew, and I'm just going to put some X's on here so I know that this is the side that I want to cut this out. And now what I'm going to do, actually I'm going to do one more thing just so I don't lose the orientation, just in case these legs are off just a little bit, is I'm going to put an arrow on the back side of this board at the bottom, and an arrow here, and a 2. That way, I've already marked the other side, so that way I'll know that this leg goes right here on this side. So I'm going to go ahead and transfer these lines to the edge and then the other face of the board, just so when I have it in the miter gauge over here at the table saw, I can keep an eye on where I need to cut just to make sure that I'm staying within my lines here. So I'm just going to take a pencil and put it right on the corner where the mark is, make a couple of lines, and then now I'm going to come down here and take that line that's on the edge, line the pencil up and bring it around to the face. So over here at the table saw, I have my miter gauge out and I have a sacrificial fence on it, and I have a notch cut out that is the same width of the blade. I just turned the table saw on and ran the fence through it just to get an exact notch of the thickness of the blade, and then I extended those lines up to the side of the sacrificial fence so that way I can see exactly where we're cutting, and those lines will be lined up with the lines that I drew on the faces of the boards. So I have a 3/4 inch dado stack raised to a 1/2 inch in the table saw. Since we're taking out an inch out of the grooves on the board on the bench top, I'm going to go ahead and do that in 2 passes. So what I'm going to do now is line up the bench top. The lines that I transferred to the face, I'm going to line it up to the groove on the sacrificial fence. And with that into place, I'm going to put a stop block down here on the other end, so that all I'll have to do is flip this board around, butt it back up against this, and make a cut. That way I know that it's going to be in the same exact spot on both sides of the bench top. Everything looks good. And what I'm also going to do, just to make sure I get a consistent depth on the grooves, is I'm going to use a push block and put downward force on the edge of the board, just to make sure that it's going to be a consistent depth. And there's the first pass. And I've still got my line, just barely, so I know that's going to be pretty good. So since we have the stop block set up, all I need to do is just spin the board around this way and butt it up against the stop block again. Check my lines, and I'm in the same exact spot, so I'm going to go ahead and make the second pass. Before moving the stop block, I'm actually going to go ahead and raise this blade to 1 inch and then go ahead and cut this groove out again, just getting it to its final depth. So that way we can go ahead and cut it out in the same exact spot, and we don't have to worry about repositioning it again after we cut this other side out. So I'm just going to move it up to 1 inch. And so now with the blade at 1 inch, all I've got to do is just butt it right back up against the stop block and make the cut. And so now it's just a matter of lining up the edge of the board with the notch and making a couple of cuts, but I'm going to lower the blade again back to 1/2 inch. barely rubbing, so I've got it at the same height as before. And just to make sure, I'm going to bring my combination square over. Check. And it's at 1 inch. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove the rest of the waste. All right, and let's see how it fits. It's nice and flush, so hopefully the other side will fit just as well. And it's just as good. So now the last one we have to mark for is the one in the center. To make a mark for the center leg, what I'm going to do is take my measuring tape and then on the edge of the board, make a mark at 12 inches. And then I'm going to carry that around to the bottom side of the bench top. And I'm going to bring that line all the way to the other side. So mine happens to be 1 5/8 inches. I didn't take it down at the 1.5 inches. So just check the thickness of yours and adjust accordingly, but I'm going to make a center line on this end and then turn it around and do the same on this side. And so now that I have the center line on both edges of this leg, I'm just going to line it up with the center lines that I marked on the edges of this bench top. And then I'm going to use my combination square again just to make sure that the leg is square. So now what I'm going to do is take my 0.5 millimeter pencil, holding down on the leg, and scribe a line. Now when I cut this out over at the table saw, my goal is to leave these two outside lines. I don't want to remove those lines because when I scribe those lines, I'm actually scribing on the outside of the board. I want this to be a snug fit. So if I have to plane my board by hand to remove some of the thickness to fit it in here, I'd rather do that. Again, I've got the blade set to 1/2 inch. I'm able to actually use the stop block that's built into my miter gauge, so I've got that set and locked into place. And again, this is away from the fence of my table saw fence just to prevent any kickback. It's probably a good 1.5 inches away. And like before, I'm going to be pushing down with this push block just to make sure that it gives it even pressure. So right out of the table saw, I know that my 3 grooves are not exactly the same depth across the width of the groove, and that's because we had to move the board, flip it around, lower and raise the blade. So there's a pretty good chance that we need to go ahead and use a router plane to make sure that all 3 of our grooves are the same exact depth. And the router plane is probably the perfect tool for that. So what I'm going to do is find the groove that's the lowest, meaning the groove that I took the most out of, set the depth of my router plane to that, and then go to the other 2 grooves and clean them up just to remove any waste and making sure that all 3 of the grooves are the same exact depth. And I'm mainly referencing this side of the router plane, keeping it flat against the bench top. I wish I had another board that was the same exact thickness as the bench top. That way it can rest on this side of the router plane, but since I don't have that, just put a lot of pressure down on this side of the router plane, keeping it flat on the bench top. And then just pivot it into your board and it'll remove the waste. So I think now's a good time to go ahead and flush these 2 surfaces up. I've just got it clamped into place with the front Moxon Vise chop removed. And so in looking at it, it appears that I'm off just a little under 1/4 inch on this side. And then bringing it in the center, it's also off 1/4 inch. And when I get over to this side here, closer to the curve, it's off a little bit more than 1/4. It's probably a 1/16 off, and I think the reason why is I must have, when I was sanding this or planing it, I must have taken it down a little too much and it's not flush. So there's a couple of things I can do. The first thing would be to flip the Moxon Vise up and plane the bottom from roughly to where it's the lowest point over here, plane it on the bottom of it from that point all the way over to the other side to level it out. And another option would be to make it flush with this side over here, and then once everything is glued together, go ahead and plane the top of this Moxon Vise rear piece from here over to make the rest of it flush. As much as I didn't want to touch this rear Moxon Vise chop, I think I'm going to have to, because in the end it's going to be easier to plane this than it is to plane the bench top itself. The bench top is actually dead perfect. It's flat. It doesn't rock at all. Everything is perfect on the bench top, so I want to leave that as it is. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and find the lowest point on the Moxon Vise, set my combination square to that, and then I'm going to remove this much from the legs. And since I'm going to be taking this and putting it in the crosscut sled, all I need is a line on one side or one edge, because now what I can do is I can take this and reference it on the kerf in my auxiliary fence, set up a stop block, and that way the other two legs will be the same exact size, just to make sure that the bench top doesn't teeter and it's dead flat. I got the stop block set up into place, and that line that I marked on my board is flush with the outside edge of the kerf of my fence here at the crosscut sled. So I'm just going to make sure this stays referenced up against the fence, and I'm going to cut these 3 legs to size. With the legs cut and put back into place, I'm actually pretty good. Flush here and flush here, believe it or not. The top of the Moxon Vise is barely high right here. So all I'm going to have to do is just plane probably from here to here in the center here to get this flush, which is way better than I thought. And I'm going to wait until everything is glued up before I flush it up, but it came out a whole lot better than I thought. The next thing I need to do is mark the location for the rear stretcher, because I need to cut out the grooves on the back of the legs. So I've got them clamped together and flush on the top and the bottom. And I've got my combination square set to 2 1/4, and referencing the top of the legs, the top that gets glued down to the bench top, I've got it referencing that. And so I'm going to put the combination square on the legs and push the rear stretcher until it touches on both sides. And now that it's in place, I'm just going to hold it with my hand and confirm that it's square to the legs on both sides, and it is. So now I'm going to hold and put pressure down on the rear stretcher while I mark it with the 0.5 millimeter pencil. And this is the area that I will be removing the waste. And this groove is, again, it's 1.5 inches wide and 1 inch deep, and we're going to be cutting that over at the table saw using the dado stack again. And on the rear stretcher, I'm going to actually cut these out last once I have the bench top glued together. That way I'll know the positioning of the 3 notches on the rear stretcher. I don't have to do any guessing. I'll know exactly where I need to cut that. This technique is not new. We did the same exact thing on the bench top, but I'm going to bring you to the back side of my miter gauge and show you that I drew the lines on the board referencing the edge. I drew them up on the face. So once again, I know exactly where I need to cut and where the waist is. So I've extended these lines on my miter gauge to the top of the sacrificial fence, just to make sure when I set my miter gauge to 2 1/4, the stop block, that the lines still line up. And I'm actually going to make the line on the miter gauge be just on the inside of my line on the board, because I can very easily plane away the excess on that rear stretcher, and you can't add anything back to the board or to the legs. So I'm going to make mine a little under the actual 1.5 inches. And saving everybody some time, I didn't show me cutting these grooves out with the dado stack. It's the same exact way. And so now I'm just using the router plane to make sure they're all the same depth. So I got the rear stretcher in, and it's actually a pretty snug fit. So when I glue that up, I may have to take a little bit off of that, but we'll deal with that when the time comes. I'm going to actually glue this in last, after the legs are already glued up into the bench top itself. So with that done, what we're going to do now is go ahead and trace out an arch on the rear legs and cut that out, just to give it a little design feature and to make it look a little bit better. Because right now it's just kind of a blocky look, and we're going to lighten that up a little bit. And speaking of lightening it up, it's also removing that waste is going to make the bench top a little bit lighter, because right now it's a few pounds. So if we can shave some of that off, it'll help us out in the long run. The first thing, according to the plans, if you want to follow the design that I have, is set your combination square to 2 inches, strike a line, and strike a line again. Next, what you want to do is find the center between those 2 lines. And mine, since it's a little bit smaller than 12, it would be, I think mine ended up being 3 and 27/30 seconds. So with my center line between these 2 lines figured out, the next thing I'm going to do is set my combination square to 3 inches and bring that line all the way to the top and make a little T. So now what you need to do is find something in your shop that you can reference that's round, that all you have to do is have it meet on all 3 points. And I happen to have this 10-inch I guess blank that I use on my table saw for a disc sander. So this one happens to fit just perfect between the lines. And then just take a pencil and draw it. And if yours is off, that's fine. Just make sure that you make all 3 of your legs the same way. That way you won't notice.
Since my bandsaw blade is relatively wide at 1/2 inch, it can't make this tight of a radius. So I'll first make some relief cuts. And when removing the rest of the waste here, I stay roughly about 1/8 inch away from my line. And then over at the spindle sander, I get the largest drum that will fit inside of this radius and clean it up.
Now I'm going to go ahead and line the edges up on this and use this as a template for the other 2 legs. Okay, let's go ahead and glue this up. So I'm going to start with the center of the bench top. Since the leg has support on both sides, it's just going to be easier to clamp it into place and then work on the outside legs. So to begin, I'm just going to put some glue in the groove here. And I've got the front of the bench facing me, just because that's probably the most important side, just in case the back is, or the leg is just a little longer. I can always flush that up on the back side of the bench. So now that I've got glue in there, I'm actually going to go ahead and spray a little bit of water on this paper towel and just get a head start on cleaning up the squeeze out. No one's ever going to be looking underneath this bench top, so it's not that big of a deal if you get a little squeeze out. After all, it is a workshop accessory. So now make sure you got the leg going the right way. Make sure you're flush on the front. Now on this end that you have the notch cut out, you want to be careful not to put too much pressure because that can break out. You don't have a lot of support. So now I'm going to get a parallel clamp on the back side, and I'm going to spin this around. So now that we have support and it's actually held up by the parallel clamps, I'm going to go ahead and do the ends. These outside legs aren't going to be as strong as this one in the center, but that's where the rear stretcher is going to come in and add some strength. Again, putting the leg in, making sure that it's flush with the edge over here. And the good thing about using the parallel clamps is I can push this leg all the way back, and when it touches this metal bar, I'll know that it's flush. So I've got the second leg in, and I made sure that it's square using the combination square. And that's where the router plane helped us out a lot. It gave us a nice flat bottom, so we know that everything is true and flat. And finally, we got the last leg, and I'm just gonna put some glue in and clamp it up the same way. Okay, so I'm gonna let this set overnight, and tomorrow we'll get the rear stretcher installed, and then we'll finish it. All right, it's been over 24 hours and I've removed the clamps, and while this was clamped up, I had some time to think about my approach on leveling this up with the front of the vise. So I've gone ahead and got it clamped up against the rear vise piece just to get a good look for how low it is compared to the rear of the Moxon vise, and I've got the front chop removed. And my approach on this is I'm actually going to be removing waste from the bottom of the Moxon vise, not the top, because the way that the holes are drilled in the front of the Moxon vise piece, it's level and flush with the top of the Moxon vise. So I want to keep that the way it is, and since I have to remove probably an eighth of an inch here in the center. I don't want to remove too much from the top of the Moxon vise. And if you remove it from the bottom of the Moxon vise, all that's going to do is give you more of a gap or more of a, I guess, a lip on that front vise piece to hit and reference the front of your workbench. So what I'm going to do is actually just flip this upside down, take my hand plane, and then remove the waste to get it flush. So to mark this, all we're going to do is just put the rear stretcher where it's going to go, make sure it's flush on the ends, and just mark them. Again, I'm just using the 0.5 millimeter pencil. And to figure out how much we need to remove is pretty simple. All you got to do is take a combination square and reference the overlap that's on the top. And that's how much we need to remove, which is 1/2 inch. So there's our marks, and it's going to be done the same exact way we did the rest of the workbench. It's just going to be using the dado stack at the table saw and notching and removing the waste. Again, just setting the depth of the blade to the combination square that we set. And if you want to make it a little less than that so it's proud, then you can plane that away. That's probably what I'm going to do, just to make it a little bit easier.
With the notches cut, I'll go ahead and glue it into place, making sure to get even glue coverage on the cheeks and the shoulders.
So now I'm going to go ahead and place the stretcher in. And then just using a block. And now all I'm going to do is just put one clamp on each end. Again, just starting in the center like I did with the legs. Let's see if I get any glue squeeze out. Yep. So I've got plenty of glue in there. So I'm just going to let this set for a few hours to dry a little bit. And then the next thing, we're going to be gluing this whole bench top to the back of the Moxon vise. So we are almost done. So this is the moment we've been waiting for, and we're going to go ahead and glue the bench top up to the Moxon vise. And I've just put glue on the side that's going to be attached to the Moxon vise. And you'll notice that it's teetering just a little bit, and that's because I still need to flush up that rear stretcher. But I can do that later. I just wanted to get this glued up to the actual vise itself. Just make sure you get plenty of glue on the surface here. So you'll remember in part 1 of the video, I actually put some finish on the back just to show how I would do it. So all I did was took some 80 grit sandpaper on my orbital sander and sanded off the shellac, because all I've got to do is just reapply the shellac once the bench top is glued to it. So now I'm going to lay this over, and I'm going to reference my workbench because it's nice and flat. So I'm going to go ahead and push the rear Moxon vise up into place. And I've got my combination square set to 3 inches, which is the offset on the Moxon vise, since it's a little bit longer. So I'm just going to put the combination square up against the edge, make sure the offset is the same on both ends, and we're good to go. And it's going to slide a little bit on you. That's fine. Just take a mallet, tap it back. All right, I've got it out of the clamps, and the last thing I need to do is bring it down and make it flush with the bench top. So I'm just going to do that with my number 3. After about 5 minutes of planing, I was able to get this flat. So I'm going to go ahead and sand the surface just using some 120 grit sandpaper before I apply the shellac. And I almost completely forgot about this back rear stretcher, so I'm going to go ahead and true that up as well with my jack plane. It's not off much. For the finishing, I'm going to paint the base the blue and then black milk paint like I mentioned earlier, and then I'm going to shellac the bench top. I've gone ahead and mixed up the blue milk paint, and I've got this covered this topic in the Raised Panel Guild build, so go check that out if you're unsure how to do it. But it's just equal parts water to the milk paint. let it set for a few minutes, and then come back and it's ready to go. But I covered that in that other video. So I've got all this taped up so I don't get any of the paint on the actual cherry itself. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is flip it over and get the top of the rear stretcher first, and then flip it back over to get the rest. And again, I'm just going to be using a gold Taklon brush to apply it. I'm just going to dip it in some water to get the brush a little wet. This makes it flow on a little bit easier. And I'm mainly doing this just so it'll look pretty cool in a few years when the black starts to fade from scratches and chips, and you'll see some of this blue bleed back underneath that. It'll look pretty cool. But again, if you're just using the same species, you can just put your finish just on top of that, just whatever you prefer. Technically, we don't want to put a real heavy film finish on this because it's just going to get dinged up, and we want it to sort of be grippy for our work pieces. So I'm just going to go with a couple of coats of shellac. So I've applied a couple of coats of the blue milk paint, and now I've sanded it with 180 grit sandpaper, and then came back with a paper towel that's wet with water and just wiped off the dust. So now it's just a matter of applying a couple of coats of the black milk paint the same exact way. So to save some time, I'm going to go ahead and apply 2 coats of shellac to the top. This is just the 2-pound cut of blonde shellac. The goal here is to not put a slick surface on this because it's a work surface after all. So I'm just going to put a couple of coats of this blonde shellac. Now I did, after sanding this, go back and fill in these some of the wormholes rather with some putty because they ended up being pretty big after taking it down to the final size. So I just used Timbermate wood filler for that in just the cherry color. But I'm just going to put a couple of coats on to finish this project up. Again, just wiping it on with the cotton cloth. With the second coat of finish on it, we can pretty much call this project done. I didn't sand between coats because I didn't want a slick surface. You want something that's going to grip your work a little bit. So it's nice and grippy, but it's not too dusty where I think it's going to create some issues with it being flat later on. This was built out of necessity for the blanket chest guild build that's coming up, but I can see myself using this in probably every project that I build from here on out. So I'm super excited to be using it, and I'm glad that I built it. As you can see, I've got a 25.5-inch long board. It's 5 inches wide. So it's going to give me the ability, this benchtop accessory, to work on longer and wider pieces than if you were to just have the Moxon Vise itself. So again, it's going to just raise it up a little bit. So if I was chiseling out waste from the dovetails with the pins, it's going to be easier on the back and a more comfortable height. Just makes it more comfortable and easier to use. So if you don't want something this big, you can easily modify the plans. But if you do build this, and I think that you would enjoy it, go ahead and post it here on SimpleCove.com and share it with others so we can all see what you built. So I guess if you're going to be building along on the blanket chest guild build coming up, you want to probably start practicing your dovetails. I'm probably going to be doing daily dovetails for the next month or so before I start the blanket chest build, just to get better at the dovetails, because I'm working with mahogany and that's not something that I want to waste and screw up on the dovetails. So if you guys do build this, like I was saying, share it here on SimpleCove, and I appreciate you guys watching and following along. And I hope you enjoy the builds and you gain something out of it. So I appreciate you watching, and I will see you in the next build video.